So what the Supreme Court did last week was so appalling and horrifying and like end game kind of shit that I've struggled to put anything together about it, to talk about it. Um, and I don't really like exclusively mean the birthright citizenship thing, which was, don't get me wrong, absolutely horrendous, but not the worst thing that they did, which is in and of itself kind of horrendous and appalling, because that should be the worst thing that they did. Because it's incredible. But when people are talking about what the Supreme Court did, they're often kind of glazing over the nationwide injunction part in order to get to the birthright citizenship thing, which I understand. Like I said, it's beyond words. But the worst thing they did was the nationwide injunction thing. And understanding that is critically important. And so I wanted to talk about that just a little bit. So just very briefly, nationwide injunctions, it's just, to put it like simply, it's when a district judge, someone below the Supreme Court, just think of it that way, a federal judge below the Supreme Court issues a ruling or a stay of a law or of a policy or of a practice of the government that applies to more than just the people who are in court. So we'll give an example here, right? Like if I were suing the federal government because I believed they were violating my constitutional rights, and I went to the judge and essentially said, they're violating my constitutional rights, but they're also violating the constitutional rights of every American with this law that they have passed or with this policy that they are enacting. The judge would issue or could issue a nationwide injunction that would stop that law from applying to everyone, right? And that would be generally before any sort of hearing. It can happen at any time, but it usually happens early because there's material harm or a risk of material harm from the law being in effect at all. And especially in the time it takes for a case to be heard, argued, all the work that goes into a case, and then ultimately for it to get to the Supreme Court, sometimes years for a case to wind its way through the courts and get to the Supreme Court, if it gets to the Supreme Court at all, because you realize the Supreme Court chooses what it hears, and often it makes as much of a statement with what it decides in a case as it does with choosing which cases it will hear and which cases it won't hear. So often, they just won't hear a case, and the lower court decisions will stand. And that's deciding the law and the interpretation and the constitutionality of something without taking really any action. It's just as much of an impact, I should say, as if they heard the case. But nonetheless, the court could issue that injunction, right? And it would stop the government from implementing a law or a policy across the country. This has been used in presidential administrations increasingly in the last decade, but it did happen prior to that. But really, it's been the last 100 years, maybe it's even fairer to say the last 50 years. Increasingly. It was used to frustrate a ton of Joe Biden's agenda. It was used a lot during the first Trump administration, and it's been used a lot in this Trump administration. But there are reasons to dislike nationwide injunctions on both sides of the spectrum. Nationwide injunctions were what were issued by the Fifth Circuit in order to try to make mifepristone unavailable to women across the country during the Biden administration. And that's the pill that's used in the majority of medication abortions in the United States. So you may remember that there was a case about that last year. And it was a nationwide injunction that was issued by a conservative judge that sought to make that medicine unavailable. So it's a really fraught issue. And it's difficult to come out and say we need nationwide injunctions to be available, as they have been available, especially when you see how it's used by conservatives. That being said, it was used a ton during the Biden administration, and this Supreme Court did nothing about it. Now that Trump's the president and it's being used against Trump, they've prioritized it. They prioritized it to the extent that they did not hear, or they did not decide on, the birthright citizenship issue. So in this case, where you have two things, nationwide injunctions and birthright citizenship, the important part to them was the nationwide injunction thing. They didn't really address the birthright citizenship thing, which is important. It's very important to keep that in mind, because this court is politicized and illegitimate. And I'll get more to that in a minute. But it's important to keep in mind what they do and how brazen they are about it, because they want to uphold this idea that they are nonpartisan and that they are not politicians. But that's a lie, an outright lie. And we need to stop supporting that lie. But anyway, so like I said, nationwide injunctions have been used increasingly during the Trump administration, because the Trump administration has increasingly been engaged in unconstitutional behavior. And if you're looking for a test case for why you need a nationwide injunction, this case is a perfect case for it, right? The government issues a policy and an executive order that blatantly runs in the face of the Constitution, right? Birthright citizenship is a very straightforward and very clear right that people have. If you're born in the United States, you are a United States citizen. There is no question of that. And regardless of what anyone says, there is not a question of it. The history supports it. And more importantly, the last 150 years of court decisions and American law and American jurisprudence all support that. That it has been the law of the land. There has not been any fucking debate about it. It's not a question. It really is not. There are some things that are open to interpretation. This is not one of them. This is straightforward and clear. And so that when the Trump administration says that, if you're born in the United States, you're not necessarily an American citizen, that is blatantly unconstitutional. There's no question of it. And a court issues a nationwide injunction, stopping that from going into effect. That is the perfect case study for why you need them. Okay. The mifepristone thing is a case study of why you wouldn't need it, and why it isn't like a place where you shouldn't use it, right? Like was based on an FDA decision approving mifepristone for use and for availability via mail and telehealth and things like that. It was all based on guidance from the FDA, and that's like just administrative, executive branch departments doing what they do, which is writing regulations and writing guidances and approving medicines, which is what the FDA does, like all working well within their constitutional powers, not violating the Constitution at all. So those are like two really just like pretty straightforward examples. And what the court did last week in the nationwide injunction case is take away that tool in the hands of lower court judges to stop the Trump administration from doing unconstitutional things, openly, blatantly unconstitutional things. And the liberal justices on the court kind of used an example. I listened to the oral arguments. I read the majority of the briefings. I've read the decisions and dissents, or the majority of them. And they keep using an example that I think is helpful, especially for if you are having conversations with conservatives or with people who maybe just don't realize how bad this is. And maybe they're a little bit more towards the center or the right, which is to say that the decision ultimately means that if you cannot afford a lawyer, you are not entitled to your constitutional rights. And that's wild. And I'm not being hyperbolic here either. So let me give you the example that they used. If a Democratic administration were to be in office, Had to let the dog inside. So if a Democratic administration were to be in office and they were to issue a ruling saying the Second Amendment doesn't mean that you have an individual right to a firearm. If they were to say, it only means that it only authorizes a militia and that's the National Guard, it doesn't mean that individual people have the right to a gun. You would have to individually sue the federal government in order to get your right to a gun back. Which sounds crazy, right? Because it is crazy. Not everyone can afford a lawyer, and you should not need a lawyer in order to have constitutional rights. Your rights should be a given. And if nationwide injunctions were available, only one person would have to sue in order to get that nationwide injunction placed. Now, as it is, it has to get up to the Supreme Court in order for a law or a policy to be overturned. And as I said at the beginning of this, the Supreme Court can make a lot of decisions about what cases it hears and what cases it doesn't hear and what it determines to be important. So the courts can just ignore something. The Supreme Court can just ignore something and neglect it and allow something to be in effect without ever having to determine the constitutionality of it. Which brings me to something else that the court did last week, which is the case about deporting people to third countries. So in this case, and I'll keep this very simple, the Trump administration wants to send people who have been deemed by an immigration judge to be deportable. It's important to keep that in mind, that an immigration judge has said, okay, yes, you can deport this person. And the Trump administration wants to, instead of sending them to where they're from, wants to send them to a third country that they've never been to. And not just any third country, like war-torn, dangerous countries like Libya and South Sudan. Wants to send people who have no ties to those countries there. And that's a violation of treaties that we've signed, by the way. It is inhumane and illegal to send somebody to a country where they face murder or torture, which you can reasonably say that they would in those countries. Nonetheless, the Trump administration wants to send people there, and a judge stopped that. And then it made its way up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court chose to hear it on what's called the emergency docket. So on a regular cases, they essentially pick what they're going to hear for the term, and we generally know what they're going to hear at the start of the term, and they schedule them throughout the term, and then we get decisions whenever they decide on it, but usually over the summer. And they come in like large batches like this. And so the court also has the option to hear something on the emergency docket. So that's like if something is, again, kind of like I said at the beginning, so important that you hear it now, because if you let it take its time to get up to the Supreme Court, someone's rights are going to be just significantly eroded. And like in this case, someone could be deported to Libya, and then you're going to wait 3 years for it to make its way up to the Supreme Court. No, it's an emergency. It needs to be handled now. But the court didn't hear it for that reason. The court determined that the emergency was that the Trump administration was being stopped from deporting people to a third country. It wasn't that the emergency was that someone was going to be deported. It was that the Trump administration's rights and powers were being stopped by a lower court judge. And it took this on the emergency docket. And the last thing I'll say about this, because I know it's kind of wonky, but when the court hears something on the emergency docket, it doesn't generally release all of the information about how it came to its decision. So you don't get like a detailed decision that gets into the constitutional law, and here's the theory that we used, and here's the laws and the precedents, and here's why this is. You also don't always find out who voted which way. So you get the numbers on who voted. So in this case, the Supreme Court determined, by the way, that the Trump administration can send people to whatever country he wants. But all you hear is that it's a 6-3 decision, and you don't know who voted what way. You don't know why they just determined that either. They don't tell you. Very, very straightforward. This is the decision, a couple sentences on procedure. That's it. They don't give you the pages of reasoning, legal reasoning for why they made this decision. So the reason why I bring that up is we have a court that is making decisions in secret, that is using its power to determine which cases it hears as a weapon, and it's using its emergency docket as a weapon. And it is saying that the Trump administration can take away your rights, and the only way that you have any recourse is if you can afford a lawyer and we determine that your case is important enough. So in the example that I was giving, let's say that there was a liberal majority on the court, and a presidential or Democratic president said what I said about guns, and took away, said everyone needs to come turn their guns in tomorrow. No lower court would have the ability to stop that. And the Supreme Court could just sit on its hands and not hear the case. And there would be nothing that anyone could do about it. That's what we're facing with everything that the Trump administration is doing right now. And the last thing that I'll say about all of this, and why I think it's so important, is this court is illegitimate, and this court is politicized. These decisions that it's making, similar, like when I was saying with how it didn't make any decision about universal or nationwide injunctions until Trump was president, that's a political decision, right? It could have made that decision during the Biden administration at any point. The decisions it makes about what cases to hear and when, largely political. It giving so much power to the Trump administration, again, political. It's increasingly split along partisan lines. 6-3 decisions are becoming the norm. And it's illegitimate for a number of reasons. But what I often think about is the fact that the Supreme Court and its ability to overturn laws, that is not in the Constitution. It's what's called judicial review. It's been a part of our constitutional or of our legal framework since about the beginning. A case called Marbury v. Madison, which you might remember from your history classes and civics classes as a child. It's very foundational to our country. But the court having the right to overturn decisions is not written anywhere in the Constitution. And I struggle to say that we need to be focusing in on that, but I feel like we do, because one court can just ruin it for everyone else, right? And it's the same thing with all these things within our constitutional system. They all assume that people are going to act in good faith. All of these rules within our system depend on people not trying to take advantage of it, not trying to break the system, right? But what we have now is people in Congress, people in the White House, and people in the Supreme Court who are intentionally breaking the system and taking advantage of the system and doing it in a hostile manner, right? To implement their own political agenda. The system is broken, irreparably broken. In no way should all of this have been the case. And the entire, people on the Democrats who say well, you should have just voted for Kamala Harris, fail to understand that if your constitutional republic can be so completely destroyed by one man, you don't have a constitutional republic. You don't have a democracy. All right? You have a farce. You have a circus. You have a joke of a government and of a country. There is no reason why one man should be able to do all of this. And there's no reason why all of these institutions should be lining up to let him do it. Okay? And the idea that all anyone needed to do was vote is so wrong and so backwards. People needed to do so much more than vote, right? By the time you got to the election, it's already too late. You understand? So many parts of this system have already been shattered to fucking pieces. The court This court would be the same court if Kamala Harris was president. All right. And they would be taking the same power onto themselves if Kamala Harris was president. And people just largely have not paid attention to the Supreme Court, whether Biden was president, whether Trump is president, whether Obama is president. They don't pay attention to the Supreme Court. How many people do you know listen to the Supreme Court oral arguments? We're a very small number of people. I promise you. All right. Like, this idea that all you have to do is just show up and vote is wrong. It's deeply wrong. And people who are so stuck on Kamala Harris, God, it just drives me insane. But nonetheless, the conversation around the court really needs to focus on the fact that they are illegitimate and that they are politicized, and that we need to be actively spreading the conversation about how what they do is not law, does not matter, and is not something that we need to be like waiting on, tenterhooks and respecting, as like holy doctrine handed down from the fucking mountaintop. When the court does something that we like, we need to treat it the same way of when the court does something that we don't like. You understand? Regardless of whether or not the Supreme Court comes out and issues a ruling that says everyone named Tyler is entitled to a fucking $1 million constitutionally, I'm going to say that they're illegitimate and that they're politicized and that what they say doesn't fucking matter. Now, they're obviously not going to come out with that ruling, but they may issue some rulings that we on the left appreciate. We need to treat them as just as toxic, just as dangerous, just as wrong as anything else that they do. And we need to, as much as possible, communicate to the other side that this court needs to be stopped, no matter what they do. I know that's difficult, but when the court comes out and issues a ruling that people on the right dislike, we need to, instead of like getting in there and arguing with them about how the court did the right thing here, we need to get in and be like, yeah, absolutely, fuck the court. We need to get court reform. We need to stop this court. We need to shut this court down. Now, look, is that going to solve a bunch of things? Not necessarily. But like, we need to think about our political philosophy and our beliefs and how they apply broadly. People in this country seem to just respond to politics. A lot of people on TikTok do this, where like they just talk about their opinion about individual issues. And there's no unifying or coherent political philosophy. It's all just like the memification and the bumper stickerification of politics, where it's all just like issue by issue by issue. Here's how I feel. And oftentimes those things contradict each other. And it depends on which party is in charge, determines how you feel about something. And we need to be kind of unified on this stuff, which is why I've, like, for instance, talked about how tariffs can be a good thing and how we should support certain tariffs. Because you can have a good impact with them. And if we want to, for instance, protect the environment, tariffs are a great way to do it. The TikTok ban. If we don't want Donald Trump ignoring laws that have been passed by Congress and approved by the Supreme Court, then we should be applying that to everything, including TikTok. And in this case, if the Supreme Court is illegitimate and politicized and shouldn't be making these like massive decisions on the shadow docket and shouldn't be making these massive decisions that overturn executive policy that is constitutional, we need to just treat the entire court and everything it does as illegitimate and politicized, regardless. I'm going to talk some more, and I've already talked too much on this video, but I'm going to talk some more about kind of what I see in terms of political philosophy and what my political philosophy is and how I apply it to some of to issues in general. But I really believe, and this is one of the most fundamental things, that the Congress is the most important branch of government. And the way that we look at the Constitution, you can see that kind of all throughout it. It's the Article 1 branch. It's easily the longest of the articles talking about the political branches, or about the branches of our government. It's given so many powers. And yet, people largely vote in presidential elections. The president is not the most democratic office. The president is an anti-democratic office. The founders, and not that I give a lot of, weight to what they wanted, but we do operate under that Constitution. We're supposed to. They did not envision a imperial president, a monarchical president. It was not an elected king. There were people who wanted an elected king, and that was a decision that was not made. They decided on this office and on this setup for the president, and it is not supposed to be the all-powerful branch, and it's not supposed to be the most important branch. The most important branch is Congress. And so we need to focus on Congress. And I don't mean we need to get out in the midterms and vote for Democrats. I mean, we need to start thinking about how we get people into Congress who align with our beliefs and who are not members of either party. And it can be done, right? It can be done. There are people in the Senate who are independents. Sure, they caucus with the Democrats. Bernie Sanders, Angus King, both independents, all right? Kristen Sinema was an independent. Joe Manchin became an independent, right? You can get independents into Congress, is what I'm saying. You don't have to overcome all the same hurdles that you do at the presidential level to get an independent in office. And we need to be looking at who are independent candidates who can run and get donations, and we should be focusing in on those people instead of individual congressmen who are just part of these political parties. Right? The Congress is how we take power back. It's the most democratic of the three branches, and specifically the House of Representatives, because the Senate is actually very anti-democratic, but it's, again, another video for another time. Anyway, I know this is really long. I hope it's helpful. I hope it helps explain the problem of what happened last week, and give you a little bit of an idea for a path forward. Really focus in on trying to understand your political philosophy and trying to find candidates, regardless of party, who you can support in the 2026 midterms. Now, I don't really believe that elections are going to be the way that we solve all these problems. But I do believe that voting is a relatively easy thing to do. And so you may as well just do it. And I believe that both of these political parties are extremely toxic and will just reinforce this problem. All these issues that we have are problems that started and have a long time ago and have continued under both parties. And the Democrats are not going to solve this for us. The Republicans are definitely not going to solve this for us. And we have to find a way to take back power from those two parties, from both of them. And so I want to advise that you find candidates who are outside of that political duopoly to support in the midterms. And, you know, if you are going to support someone who's a Democrat, I also recommend that you focus in on democratic socialists at the very least, and find Democrats who are not highly affiliated with the Democratic Party. People who, like I said, have like secondary affiliations with either Democratic Socialists or other groups who are maybe just using the Democratic Party as a way to get elected. But I would also like to see people who are in Congress right now who claim to be the biggest critics of the Democratic Party, people like AOC or Jasmine Crockett, renounce the Democratic Party and declare themselves independents. And I don't think that's really that hard for them to do, especially since they have such massive platforms. You know, AOC could win as an independent if she wanted to. Jasmine Crockett could win as an independent if she wanted to. And don't get me wrong, those people are to the right of me, but they also have huge platforms and are highly capable communicators who can, you know, get a lot of stuff done, especially if they free themselves from that bondage of the Democratic Party. So I encourage you guys to encourage them to do that. We need to get out from underneath these two parties just drastically. But yeah. Anyway, long video. I hope everyone's doing well. Happy Monday. And yeah, that's all I got.